Millie's bread lesson. Well now, I thought I heard a knock. Look at you, my dear, there on my doorstep. Yes, my name is Dory, and who might you be? Come on in, won't you? No need to stand out there. I was just about to make a pot of tea. Will you have some? The visitor nodded and stepped into the small entry. Behind her, the wooden screen door slammed shut, the loud snap of the spring latch, sharp enough to startle the visitor, who quickly stepped from the tiny porch. She followed her hostess across the linoleum-covered floor into the warm kitchen. Dory turned to the sink and rinsed a squat brown teapot. The kettle's just on the boil. You can join me. Just sit and take a load off your feet. I'm here to speak about your neighbor. Have you a few minutes? Dory nodded. She pulled 2 wooden chairs out from the small linen-covered kitchen table, motioned her guest into a chair, and settled herself opposite, sideways on her chair, alert to her guest. You want to talk to me about a neighbor who just passed away? Millie Smith, I suppose. Well now, I think I just might recognize you. Dory managed a swift intake of her breath. Yeah, she said. Breathing out, Dory continued. I've seen your picture. You're that young woman who writes for the Record. Isn't your name Ella? Millie Smith, you say? Yes, well, I suppose you want to talk some about Millie, so you can put it in the paper. Yes, I am Ella, and I do write for the Record. And yes, I would like to talk to you about Mrs. Smith. She was so valued by our readers. And by her neighbors here, too. I'd love to talk about Millie. Just let me start the tea. Dory sprang from her chair, measured 3 spoonsful of loose tea into the brown teapot, added the boiled water, and set the teapot on the stove. That's just the way I make tea. 1 spoonful for you, 1 for me, and 1 for the pot, just the way my mom taught me. And without waiting for more than a slight nod from her guest, Dory continued. Well now, Millie and I were neighbors for years, and I guess I knew her just as well as anybody did. She was one kind woman, bright too, smart as anything. A teacher before she was married, you know. For years she wrote up the local news for your paper. Everybody would be looking for Millie's items when the paper came out, to see if she mentioned your name, see? She never missed a trick of what was going on in the community. Dory briskly stepped from kitchen table to stove, reached into the nearby cupboard, and lifted down 2 stacked cups and saucers. We'll have our tea in Royal Albert teacups today, since you're a special visitor. It'll be a little celebration of Millie, too. Dory turned quickly to the refrigerator and brought out a small jug of milk, barely stopping her one-sided conversation as she reached into a nearby cabinet to grasp a flowered metal can. She opened the can and placed it on the table. We need a cookie with our tea. Would a molasses cookie or 2 do for you? Oh, you have a notebook. That's good. So you can write while I talk. Good idea. Can you keep up with me? I guess you can get the most important things, but then it's all important, isn't it? Dory poured out the tea, placed a fine china cup and saucer in front of Ella, and set the other for herself. She settled into the chair opposite her guest. This is so thoughtful of you, Dory. Thank you, my dear. It's nice to have your visit. Dory took a quick breath. Now back to Millie. For years she played the organ for our church every Sunday morning, and often the one across the road. Sometimes United and Baptist, both on the same morning. She wrote up weddings and funerals, and she played the organ at most of them, sang at some of them too when she was asked. And she never did learn to drive, so she rode to funerals with the undertaker, the coffin in the back of the hearse, you know. She knew them all. Everybody knows everybody around here, see? And sometimes she would take a real small electric organ along, one so small it could set on her lap, so the family could have music if the funeral was in a house where there was no organ. Good thing to do. Dora rose from her chair, lifted the teapot, gesturing whether her guest might like more tea. Responding to Ella's nod, Dora added hot tea to the Royal Albert cups. And she wrote up all the minutes for most of the community organizations like the Women's Institute and rural beautification meetings, the lodge events, farm forum, and the women's church groups. She always said if you could do something for your community, you should never wait to be coaxed. Just do it. She believed if there was something you knew how to do, then you should do it for the good of all. Dora settled in her chair, her hand on the delicate cup. She chose a cookie, looked at it carefully, and waited a brief moment, as if she expected the cookie to speak. She took a quick bite, chewed thoughtfully, and sipped her tea. Quickly, Ella intervened. "Thanks for a lovely cup of tea and a molasses cookie. My mum made those too. Can I ask a couple of questions while you have your tea?" Dora nodded as she again lifted the cup to her lips. "You are so helpful. What can you share about Millie's husband?" Dora swallowed quickly. "Oh, yes." Dora let her inhaled breath relax. She continued. "Millie's husband, Lorne, died a few years ago. He was a real nice man. They made a fine couple. You can tell I do love to talk. Some people tell me I talk even on the in-breath, that I must have been vaccinated with a gramophone needle." She paused a moment to let her words sink in. "We're all great talkers hereabouts, because when we meet somebody new, we always have a lot to say, and most of us talk fast because we don't have many new people to talk to, see? And the neighbors here, they already know everything you might want to say." Ella nodded, silent and wide-eyed. The hint of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. Sure enough, that Millie was smart. She was a great reader. She loved books. She could knit without even a look at the socks she worked on, and she sewed and quilted really fine. She often said she would rather quilt than eat. A great baker, too, especially a good bread maker, and she had to be. When Millie was a young mum, they had 10 kids and ate a lot of bread. But it wasn't always like that. No siree. Over her spiral notebook, she wrote quickly. Even after years of interviews, it was a challenge to keep up with Dora. When she was first married, Millie, she was about 5'9" or 10, and she weighed under 120 pounds. Thin as a rail she was, and she and her husband Lorne lived in half of that double house down in Little Forks, just away up the road from Dr. Drury's place. "Can I offer you more tea?" Dora reached for the teapot, filled Ella's cup, and paused to slightly tilt the pot. Dora raised the spout to divert a drop of tea that threatened to drip on the linen tablecloth before she returned the brown teapot to the stove. With a brief pause, she continued. "The people in the other half of that house were Cassie and Ben. Cassie was smart as a whip, and she could do anything, Millie said. When Lorne and Millie moved in, Cassie made them a present of a fresh loaf of her own homemade bread. Everyone made their own bread back then. Cassie's bread was pretty good, so Millie told me. When that loaf was about gone, Millie thought she'd better get busy and learn to make bread herself. Her parents were older when they had her, see? They thought this slim bit of a girl should not have to do anything but play music and sing, so they didn't teach her how to make bread or do chores in the house. No, siree. But there, Millie told Lorne that she needed to make bread, but that she didn't know how. And he said, "Well, I know. Mother taught all her kids to make bread, so tomorrow morning I'll get you started on it before I go to work." "Another molasses cookie, Ella? You're pretty slim yourself." "Molasses cookies are good for you. Did you know that?" Dora lifted the teapot to refill the china cup of her guest. She slid the cookie tin within easier reach of Ella, who nodded her thanks as she made quick notes. Next day, sure enough, they set out the yeast and a bit of sugar, the salt, the flour, the lard, and the right amount of water, and he explained, Lorne did, how she should mix and raise and knead and cook the bread. That night, when he got home from work, there was Millie sitting in the rocking chair, crying her eyes out, and not a loaf of bread in sight. Not one. "Whatever is the matter?" Lorne said, and Millie told him, "I mixed the bread just the way you told me, but I couldn't get it to rise. It wouldn't even come up to the edge of the bowl for me to knead it down. How am I going to face her when I can't make even one loaf of bread? I will be so ashamed." Oh dear. Ella, wide-eyed, felt a brief concern for Millie. This was not so good. Dora continued. Millie wept so that Lorne felt awful sorry, and he told her, "Don't be upset. Cassie doesn't even have to know your bread didn't rise. Tonight, after dark, I'll take that bread outside, and I'll bury it under that old spruce tree. She'll never know. Tomorrow morning we'll both get up a little early, and I'll show you how to set the bread, and it will turn out just fine." And it did. Yes, it sure did. After supper, they took a cup of tea and a slice of Millie's new bread, and they set out by the back door to enjoy the evening. Just then, Millie noticed there was something funny going on under that old spruce tree. Said she could see something white under the tree, like a great big white hump it was. They had a closer look, and wouldn't you know, there was her first batch of bread. Lorne had buried it in the earth under the big spruce tree, and after a few hours that warm earth made the yeast begin to work, and that bread started to rise. It bulged up through all the soil he'd shoveled onto it. I don't know what they did about it then, but I expect he covered it up a second time. He was a kind man. He wouldn't want her feelings hurt. Ella rose from her chair. "Dora, I must fly. Thank you for everything. The tea, the cookie, the lovely stories of Millie Smith. I think I have notes enough." She moved across the kitchen floor to the tiny entry. Dora left her chair to show her guest to the screen door. Her words followed Ella to her car. "I hope you heard enough for the write-up in the record. I'll be watching for it, Ella. My dear, you just come again any time. Next time I'll sip my tea and let you do the talking."